Chapter 4, American Life in the 17th Century, 1607 or 1692. Let's get started. A couple key concepts as always. First of all, there's a stark contrast between New England and the Chesapeake. Religion, subsistence farming, fishing, shipbuilding, that'll be the norm in the north, whereas the southern colonies will turn to cash crop agriculture instead. Now, despite these differences, the seeds of an Atlantic seaboard economy are being planted, and you might even make a stretch and say that a unique American, I said American here, that's probably too far of a stretch, but certainly in the first century of existence, the colonies are adapting to their environment, they're changing, and a unique sort of North American colonial identity is actually forming. Here is a tobacco plant, which you probably would have seen everywhere in the Chesapeake. I believe the text said that they actually, in some places, planted tobacco prior to planting corn, so obviously that was important to them. And a little different scene here in New England, and you can just smell that fish rotting on the wall there, can't you? I can. While the climate of the Chesapeake was quite suitable to tobacco cultivation, it was also suitable to disease. And the text said that many people died in the Chesapeake from disease, and many didn't survive past age 20. Again, don't forget that a lot of these were single men. They were very much preoccupied with profit and growing tobacco. I'm going to assume that that didn't necessarily help their chances for survival. That said, though, by the start of the 18th century, Virginia was the most populous colony with 59,000 people, and Maryland the third after Massachusetts with 30,000 people. So if you look at this graph, you can see that the population growth in Virginia was fairly steady, but also slow in its initial stages. But here you can see New England growing a bit more quickly in the early stages, in the early part of the 17th century. But again, by the 1800s, now you're going to see Virginia surpass that. By 1630, 1.5 million pounds of tobacco were shipped out of the Chesapeake annually, and almost 40 million by the end of the century. Again, the demand for tobacco was insatiable. It was huge. In order to cultivate this crop, indentured servants would be used initially. Indentured servants were people who traded 5 to 7 years of their labor to a person who would pay their passage. And upon completion of this time that they were to serve as a servant, they were also guaranteed their freedom dues, and that could include some corn, some clothes, perhaps some land. Virginia and Maryland used something called the headright system, and it was the wealthy planters who benefited from this. If you paid the passage of a laborer to come to this new world, you would receive 50 acres of land. So again, the person who's paying the passage is fronting the money, but he's getting the labor, which produces the tobacco, which leads to more profit, and he also acquires more land, which is the commodity that you want. Chesapeake planters brought some 100,000 indentured servants to the region by 1700, and the text tells us that 3/4 of all European immigrants to the Chesapeake in the 17th century were, in fact, indentured servants. Now, here's an ad for a different type of servant, if you will, a person who could serve as a tutor, actually. But again, these types of ads may have been commonly seen in some of these British port cities, again, enticing people to come to the New World for the hope of acquiring their own land and a chance at a free life. Now, here's a good little thing to put in your bank here of stats to know. 1676, 100 years prior to the Declaration of Independence, there is a rebellion, and it's staged by a man named Nathaniel Bacon. He and about 1,000 Virginians do revolt against the Virginia government. They're not very happy with the governor of Virginia, William Berkeley. He was very friendly towards the Indians. And so these frontiersmen now, again, these indentured servants, if they aren't given land, it's not going to be prime land. It's going to be sort of off in the west. And I think many of them actually went farther west seeking arable land to plant. But they are the folks who are in that frontier region, and they are the folks who are dealing with this constant threat of Native American attack. And so when Governor Berkeley does not really help them out, the rebels begin attacking Indian villages themselves. And in fact, you can see they also attacked Jamestown and torched the capital. Bacon suddenly did die from disease in the middle of this, and as a result, Berkeley was able to crush the uprising, hanging more than 20 rebels. Bacon's rebellion, though, what you should know and do not forget, is it will usher in the era of African slavery, as people are afraid of these indentured servants now who are disgruntled and seeking some sort of retribution. There's Bacon. Now, Africans were brought to the New World here as early as 1619. We did talk about that already, but they were not very commonly used in terms of their labor. By 1670, there were only about 2,000 in Virginia, about 7% of the total population of the South. In the 1680s, wages in England rose, decreasing the number of people who might have seen indentured servitude as a viable option for them. And again, we just had in 1676 we had Bacon's Rebellion. So all of that leads towards this shift, or a shift towards African slavery. And by the mid 1680s, black slaves outnumbered white servants among the plantation colonies in terms of new arrivals. In 1698, the Royal African Company lost its monopoly on carrying slaves to the colonies, and many colonies and colonists, including Rhode Islanders, entered into the slave trade. African Americans accounted for half the population in Virginia by 1750. Again, this is prior to the Revolution, but in a pivotal time in American history. In South Carolina, slaves outnumbered whites 2-1. Most slaves came from the west coast of Africa in what is now Senegal to Angola. And in 1662, Virginia enacted the slave codes, and these laws made blacks and their children property, or chattel, and that's for life. Here is an artist's rendition of sort of what's sometimes called the tight pack. African Americans, I should say African slaves, after they're captured, were obviously brought to the New World aboard ships. And as you can see, they were packed in as tightly as possible. Here is that region in Western Africa where many of these slave ports actually were. In the coming chapters, we'll be talking about overt and covert resistance to the slave situation. But in Chapter 4, a few things are noted. First of all, there is an African language. It's going to be a blend of English and several African languages that emerges on the plantations. It's called Gullah. I believe the text said it's probably a corruption of Angola. And there also is a slave revolt that's discussed in this chapter as well. In 1712, a slave revolt killed 12 whites and caused the execution of 21 blacks after it was crushed. But the big one here is going to be the Stoner Rebellion, in 1739. In South Carolina, along the Stono River, a large-scale, relatively speaking, large-scale revolt exploded. The rebels tried to march to Spanish Florida, but they were stopped by a local militia. And here is a sign commemorating that. Now, on the eve of the Revolutionary War, 70% of the leaders of Virginia legislature came from families established in Virginia before 1690. And we call them the First Families of Virginia, or the FFVs, you can see there. On the bottom right here, you see Stratford Hall. It was the ancestral home of the Lees of Virginia, as in Robert E. Lee. I actually had the pleasure of going to that plantation, and I've been inside that tower, believe it or not. It's not that spectacular. But certainly these are the wealthy planters that control vast tracts of land as far as the eye can see. And of course, they will find themselves atop the social scale. Below them, though, the largest social class in the South would have been the small farmers. And later on, again, we'll talk about sort of the number of slaves that they may have owned in comparison to the large-scale planters. The large planters really would have had upwards of 200 in some cases, such as Jefferson and Monticello, whereas the small farmers may have had one or two. Then there were the landless whites below them, and these may have been former indentured servants or folks that had sort of ventured off to the frontier. And at the bottom of that social scale were the slaves, of course. And the text does contrast New England with the South pretty clearly. In fact, they said that life expectancy in New England increased. Something about a sip of New England air was better than a full pint of English ale or something like that. But New Englanders had something on their side as well. Aside from the climate, they had the family. And in fact, they often came to the New World as a family unit, and therefore that obviously helped them to grow naturally, we'll just say. Southern colonies generally allowed married women to retain a separate title to their property, something a bit more progressive, I suppose, than this puritanical way in New England. And they gave widows the right to inherit their husbands' estates. That was not necessarily the case in New England, where Puritan lawmakers were afraid that recognizing women's separate property rights would, in fact, undercut the unity of married persons by acknowledging conflicting interests. Now, New England women usually gave up their property rights when they married, and above all, in New England, the laws of Puritan New England sought to defend the integrity of marriages. There's a Puritan woman at the spinning wheel. We'll talk about gender roles towards the end of this chapter. So I'm from New England, so I'm a little bit biased here, but I think the American Pageant is as well, because it does actually specifically say that New England has a lasting impact on the development of American culture and the country in general. Some examples you might see would be how towns were laid out with great care. These new towns have been legally chartered by colonial authorities. Land was distributed and entrusted by sober-minded town officials, it said in the text. And families received several parcels of land, one for a homestead, one for grazing, one for a source of timber, for example. Education is going to be a very cornerstone, I should say, of New England society. In fact, towns that had more than 50 families had to have an elementary school. And the text does, at this point out that Harvard College was founded in 1636, just 8 years after Massachusetts was founded. And they compare that with the first university in Virginia, William and Mary, which was founded in 1693. Something we talked about in Chapter 3, but it's worth saying again, that this sort of democratic principle within the Congregational Church will lead to democracy in public life and political government. And again, the town hall meeting is where that happens. Here is a picture of New Haven and the 9-square system that perhaps you are familiar with, the green in the center, and the town laid out around that. And it reminds me somewhat of the way that the Northwest Territory will be laid out after the Revolutionary War. One of the things that is considered a success under the Articles of Confederation is the organization of this new Northwest Territory. When we say Northwest, we're talking about the Illinois area, Ohio area, not Oregon. But again, it's sort of very orderly. And in fact, one of the squares you can see here on this diagram was specifically set aside for public education. So again, carrying that idea, the importance of education forward. So obviously we've been talking about religion as a cornerstone of New England colonial life, and right now we're going to look at a couple of changes and some pretty dramatic scenes throughout that. In the mid-17th century, we're going to see these new Jeremiah sermons being delivered. As I understand it, sermons and church service in the Congregational Church in 17th century New England were not all that comfortable. It was cold, you had like a bench to sit on, and the sermons lasted for quite some time. These Jeremiah sermons actually reminded you of God's power and the dangers of crossing Him. We can kind of leave it at that. We'll look at one in class. In fact, you're going to read it in history and in English. It's called Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. That's a good one. 1662, there's a change in sort of the church structure. It's called the Halfway Covenant. As you can imagine, it's sort of like this, I don't know, excitement to be a part of this very rigid religious structure is on the wane. And so in order to keep church membership up, the Halfway Covenant would admit to baptism, but not full communion, the unconverted children of existing members. So again, it sort of relaxes the requirements for being members of the church, and what that does is increase church membership. In 1692, we have the Salem witch trials, which I'm sure just about everybody's heard about. There's a lot of things going into this in terms of the region within the colony that the accusers and the accused came from, as well as the suspicion that perhaps there was some tainted water that they were drinking as well. But nonetheless, a group of adolescent girls claimed to have been bewitched by a few older women, and a witch hunt ensued, leading to the legal lynching of 20 women in 1692. One person was crushed to death, and I think the text said they killed 2 dogs as well. By 1693, the witchcraft hysteria ended. and the governor of Massachusetts prohibited any further trials and pardoned those already convicted. I think they paid reparations to the families eventually. And here is that sermon by Jonathan Edwards. Again, we'll read that in class. Stay tuned. So aside from the church, it's the soil and the climate that really shape New England way of life. First of all, the soil is not conducive to large-scale farming. There's a lot of rocks here, and so we have to find other ways to make a living in New England. As a result of that, there is less diversity, as newcomers from Europe didn't necessarily want to move to a place where the soil was not bad, but not great, let's just say. They could have, and they did, go to places like Pennsylvania first. In terms of the climate, it's nice to have 4 seasons, but the summertime can be very humid, or in this case, September is very humid, and the winter is also a bear. New Englanders instead became experts at shipbuilding and commerce, and they fished cod, as you may know. Calvinism, soil, and climate, it said in the text somewhere, made for energy, purposefulness, sternness, stubbornness, self-reliance, and resourcefulness. It's the Yankee way. And here's a rock wall, which you see pretty much everywhere in Connecticut, where I live. Very nice. Obviously, those were all at one time in the ground, and folks were trying to grow things like corn, had to dig them up. While I think this chapter clearly contrasts the Chesapeake and New England, it also exposes some similarities as well. For example, gender roles are pretty similar both in the North and the South. Women were weaving, cooking, cleaning, and caring for children, whereas men were more involved with manual labor. They're clearing land and building fences and cutting firewood and butchering livestock and so forth. We also see this growing resentment against upper-class pretensions, and that helped to spark outbursts like Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. And as we move forward throughout this story, you'll see that there's an emerging frontier interest that is going to be in competition with a more established Eastern interest. All right, that's it for Chapter 4. Thank you so much for watching. Looking forward to class on Wednesday. See you then. Take care.